Welcome all hunters, anglers, trappers, and shooters to the only fish and wildlife conservation podcast that goes behind the scenes of the business of conservation, the Connecting with Conservation podcast. Our podcast is hosted by John Gassett from the Wildlife Management Institute and Jim Cucaruto of the Outdoor Stewards of Conservation Foundation. John and Jim will talk with experts from all sectors of the conservation arena about their passion for conserving the great outdoors. So please welcome our hosts of the Connecting with Conservation podcast, John and Jim.
Hello again, and welcome to another episode of Connecting with Conservation, the only podcast that goes behind the scenes to look at the business of conservation in our country. I'm John Gassett with the Wildlife Management Institute and your co-host for Connecting with Conservation. Here with my good friend and co-host, Jim Cucaruto from Outdoor Stewards. Jim, how you doing?
Good. I kind of said this before, and I'll say it again. You know, we at Connecting with Conservation, we're always learning something new. Historically, we've had a lot of guests on that I've known, but every once in a while I get one on that I've, passed by in the hallways at conferences with. And today we got one of those that I don't know that well, but I'm excited about the topic. So Casey Stemler, why don't you, we'll welcome you, but why don't you tell us a little bit about your background, and then we'll get into some of the things that you're working on.
Sure. Thanks, Jim. Pleasure to be here today. So I started out as a wildlife biologist, and that's the path I thought I would follow, and I ended up in Alaska as my first gig, and then ended up in wildlife research. And as I started doing research and working on papers to get published, I started realizing that all the science work that we were conducting wasn't really being used to make management decisions, and that made me stop and say, maybe I don't want to do this anymore. Maybe I want to go to Washington, D.C. and get involved in policy and politics. Now, I'm a Westerner. I had never been east of the Mississippi River. I didn't know what I was saying when I said maybe I should go east to Washington, D.C. And I'll tell you, when I was in Alaska, John Turner was the director of the Fish and Wildlife Service. And I didn't know any different. I'm, just a country boy, and it's like we shake hands and talk to people, look them in the eye, and that's how I address everything. It's the director. It's just another man to me. So I wrote him a letter. Once I told my boss, he about fell out of his chair. You did what? I go, well, what's he going to do? So I get a letter back, and there's handwritten stuff on it. And I was like, wow. And he's talking about tough row to hoe, but, keep after if you want to do it. So ended up in Washington, D.C., and I won't tell you all of the jobs I did, but I ended up in Washington, D.C., and that led to me actually getting a fellowship through Georgetown University. I ended up on Capitol Hill, working on appropriations committee on the House side, and then working in a member's office on the House side. And of all things, their legislative assistant left, I ended up doing healthcare. So I'm watching these healthcare debates, and I just sit back and laugh because it's so terribly complicated that thank God I'm not doing that anymore. Anyway, life moves on, and Trump won, Bush administration comes in, and I just left Capitol Hill, came back to the Fish and Wildlife Service and Legislative Affairs, and a guy named Steve Williams became the director of the service. I didn't know Steve Williams, but this thing called CWD broke out, and we started learning more about chronic wasting disease and how it spreads around the country, and I was asked to come back permanently on Capitol Hill, and I told Steve that, and he says, well, hey, I want to bring you on as a special assistant, and I want you to focus on chronic wasting disease initially. And so I did, and that led to sage grouse. That was another gift that Steve gave me, sage grouse. That was another fun one. And again, time goes on. I come back west, thank goodness, and I become the Prairie Pothole Joint Venture Coordinator. So I work on waterfowl conservation in the prairie states, and I do that for 12 years. And it's grassland birds, water birds, shore birds, but predominantly waterfowl here. So to wrap it up on where I'm from, I started as a research person, wildlife biology in the field, but then realized I needed to be back where the policy and decisions are made. So I went from the field to Washington. Then I came to a regional office, which was kind of backward, but that's how I did it.
Yeah, so that's cool. That's something I didn't know about you, and I've known you a long time, but we both worked for Steve Williams then. So
yeah.
And he does like to hand off thorny problems from time to time. So
well, I'll say this: I hope Steve listens to your podcast, because I have to say that he was one of the better bosses I've had. I remember vividly on sage grouse in particular, Gail Norton was the secretary, and Steve would get yarded up there often to, talk about whatever issue. And vividly, I remember this. Steve would always come down to my office. He goes, "Come on, you just have to know Steve." And I go, "Where are we going?" He goes, "We're going up to the secretary's office." And I was like, "Okay." And for younger biologists at the time, that was, well, I'm going up to the secretary's office. So we go up there and sit down, and she looks at Steve and says, "Okay, Steve, go ahead." And she goes, "I'm not saying anything." He goes, "You invited me, but the guy that knows it all is this guy, Casey Stemler." And I'll never forget that, because I've had bosses that want, when you become a leader, in my view, your job is to shed the light back on your people. There are some leaders, too many in my view, that can't get out of that limelight, and they forget about all the people that are doing the work to get them and make them be successful.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah. Well, Steve's not that way, and Steve never once did that. He always wanted to say, "No, this is the person that knows it. Let him speak." And that really means, and then you work twice as hard for that kind of boss. So, yeah.
So the other thing that surprised me is I've never known a biologist that went from Alaska to DC willingly.
Yeah.
That's maybe a character flaw. So, well, we wanted to come on today because I know one of the big initiatives you worked on was the Wildlife Corridor initiative. And, it's one of those things that as biologists, we knew that those things were important, but it seemed to not gel for a while until we started figuring out, hey, not only these things move around, they move around a lot, and there are a lot of, human-formed impediments to them doing that. So let's talk a little bit about, what corridors are. So, our audience is a pretty general audience, and we spend a lot of time talking about how conservation is paid for and funded and all that. But, we do like the science side of it too. What are these things for? What do they mean? And what do they do for wildlife?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier we'll get to this subject. So I'm back there in D.C. on detail. I'm sitting in the Deputy Secretary's office, and if I learned anything all my years in Washington, D.C. is don't assume the political appointees know the stuff that we know in conservation. And what I've learned early in my career back there was all these NGOs, non-governmental organizations, I won't name them, come to D.C., they're going to sit down with the director or the secretary, whoever, and they dump a bunch of problems on the table. And then they walk out. And for some reason, they think that the people that are dumping it on actually know what to do and how to fix it. That happens all the time, happens to this day. Fascinates me that folks still do that, but that's what happens. So sitting there, I realized, I have a unique opportunity here. They want to do conservation, but they're not exactly sure how to do it. And so I'm, again, from the West, and I watched really the winter habitat for big game. You come out here in the West, and the valleys are the developed areas because that's what the settlers developed first, because that's typically where the water is. And so the animals still need to move down out of the high elevations to have resources to survive the winter. And these winter ranges, as we call them, are being really developed. So I thought maybe there's something I can do on winter ranges. And then my mind went to big game, and I went, wow, the federal government isn't really in the big game space. That's a state Fish and Wildlife Agency's jurisdictional authority. How could I do this? How could I make this work? So I wrote just a 2-page document. I gave it to a state director. I said, hey, can you take a look at this? Tell me what you think. I gave it to the head of a non-governmental organization, and I said, tell me what you think. And they both came back saying, this would be good if we could do this. Thumbs up. So I gave it to David, a deputy secretary, and he took it to Ryan Zinke, the secretary at the time. And next thing I know, he comes back to my office. He goes, we're doing this. And I was like, well, that's great. Okay. And that was the end of it. And I came back to Colorado, and I thought, I don't know what that meant, but here we are. And I must have got a phone call, I don't know, a month later saying, can you write a Secretarial Order? And so that's where this Secretarial Order 3362 came from. So I wrote this order, still not thinking I was going to be the one implementing it. And I tell this a lot when I give presentations on this topic is when you write something in government, envision yourself doing it. Don't write it, not envision yourself do it, because I looked at it going, now how the hell am I going to implement this? Because I never thought I would be the one implementing it. I thought someone else would have to do it. So long story short, I was really focused on the wintering habitat because that's where we're losing. But in the West, we call them migration corridors or just wildlife movements. Some animals move from the top of the mountain to the bottom of the mountain in the winter because of the temperatures and the food availability changes, so they have to move to be able to get the resources they need to do that. And I would say back east, I mean, you see deer. Look, think about the rut. white-tailed rut, those deer are needing to move around to find does. It's conceptually the same thing. So I looked at the winter range, but I was like, well, they have to get there. So the corridor is the path that they use to get there. And it's ironically, now we know, very consistent that they use these same areas on an annual basis. And it's only because of advances in technology, satellite collars that we put on these animals that allow us to determine where these animals are moving. We can tell within minutes where they're moving, how they're moving. And analytical things that have been developed can really analyze these data now. We have these spaghetti-looking things that go across the landscape, and it shows the intensity of use, high, low, medium, and how they're moving about the landscape. The part that was missing from all this that I didn't include was what we call the summer range, and that's where the animals go to have young, raise their young, and move. That was a different department, and that's starting to come online now as Department of Agriculture, typically the Forest Service in the West anyway. And so the corridors are just vital, because once those are cut off, those animals can't move to get the resources they need to survive. And what you'll see over time is the populations will just slowly decline to where they're gone. And that's just the human development that we have out here is critical. I mean, it's overwhelming, and it's critical that we conserve these areas the best that we can. And I would say one last thing on this whole concept. If you can think about corridors, it's not just big game. Having lived in Washington, D.C. and worked in the East, I remember vividly turtles. And the turtle migration, they migrate from one pond that's on this side of the road, and they try to get to the other. Frogs do the same thing, and I've seen I don't even know how many tens and thousands of frogs dead on some of the highways back east. It's the same concept. So those animals are moving from one spot to another to get a resource they need. It could be mating, it could be food. So I talk about the West a lot because that's where I live and that's where I work most, but this applies throughout the United States, quite frankly.
Yeah, and another species that a lot of people don't think about, but they see them when it happens, they just don't put two and two together, are gray squirrels in the East. Gray squirrels, with mass crop failures, they'll have mass migrations of squirrels. So you'll see some years there's just roadkill squirrels everywhere. And I don't think most people see that and they don't think of anything about it, but it's the squirrels moving to try to find food. And, they cross roads and they get run over more frequently. So
yeah. And that's one of the things that this whole effort, I think the reason it's taken off, John, you asked the question really, is because the federal government has never taken this on. And we came to the table with the attitude that the federal government's not here to help. That's not how I approached it. I approached it as, we have some resources that we can bring to you, state fish and wildlife agencies, to work in partnership. So you, the state fish and wildlife agency, who have the jurisdictional authority, tell us where the most important areas are for these big game species. And that's how we approached it. We didn't approach it from a normal federal heavy-handed approach. We approached it from, we have some resources you don't have. How can we deploy those across your states to make an impact? And so we brought money to the table for research that we gave to the states. We didn't tell them what research to do. We said, we have this amount of money that you can use to do research. We gave sideboards, that's it. And the same we did for habitat conservation as well. And through all of this, that started in 2018, and it's still very, very well supported and very active. In fact, it's very, very difficult to find an initiative or an effort to make it through different presidential administrations or Secretarial Order in this case. And so that's just a very unique thing in the conservation world to have happen. But I think the biggest thing from my seat that's come out of it is also the highway stuff, because we're talking about flattened ground squirrel or gray squirrels and turtles and frogs and out here big game that kill people when they hit them. It's a very different situation. And now that we have this in place and now that we have the data, we are able to pinpoint where these important areas are on the landscape to put underpasses, overpasses, or just fencing up to keep the animals off the highway so that they're not being killed disproportionately high numbers in some areas. So that for me is just a big highlight that it just wasn't getting the attention it deserved, and now it is. So.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things I've always thought, and being a former state guy, and you can appreciate this, I was always, I don't need the feds in my business unless I ask them to be there. But it always made sense to me when you talk about big game migrations, and because they are crossing state lines. They're crossing federal highways. They're primarily on federal land most of their lives. There's tons of federal nexus there for these species. And so it seems like it's a natural fit for the Fed, the service, and the other federal agencies to partner with the states to solve this problem.
Yeah, I think, John, but it was how it was approached too. It's just having done government for so long, I've just seen too many instances where it's Big Brother, and we're going to come in and tell you how to do it, and that's just not effective conservation. It's just not how you do things effectively, and there just becomes resentment, all that stuff. We did none of that, and I really do think that's what built the strong support base to keep this going. And so I hope others emulate it and other tasks that they're trying to do and approach it in the same fashion, and I think you'd have a lot more luck. And I would add, in fact, the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies now has developed their own wildlife movement and connectivity initiative. And so that just tells you that, okay, now the states have said, you know what, we want to have something that's our own, meaning that if an federal administration does come along in the future and decide to do away with this, it doesn't matter because we have our own initiative that's working hand in glove with this Secretarial Order I mentioned, but it gives them much more control as well. So they're not dependent on the winds of the federal government. And I think that was very, very smart of them to do that. And so the support's very, very strong in the state, still strong with the tribal community and with our NGO partners. And so hopefully it'll keep going long before we're all gone. And I think with all the things that are impacting our big game species, man, if we don't really start honing in on some of this stuff, again, I know whitetail, probably a lot of listeners are used to whitetail, and I love them. I think they're way better eating than mule deer. But they don't have the same pressures as elk, deer, pronghorn, mule deer, moose, sheep in particular. I want to start talking about sheep. And we're just seeing things that declines in some areas that are just caused by human development. And if we don't start doing stuff to try to rectify this, folks will be sitting around 10 years going, what the hell happened? 15 years. Yeah.
Well, I give you credit, Casey. I appreciate that. I want to thank you for doing the work you're doing because, I don't think unicorns exist, but I might be talking to one. There's not a lot of people that can do what you're doing. I mean, go from wildlife biology to politics and back and get everybody on the same page because it's very rare, Yeah, even now, I bet you there aren't people that are on the same page. There's these rewilders and the preservationists that say, oh, just leave the animals alone. But you mentioned the human population's growing. You can't leave them alone. And I'm an East Coast guy, so I really don't pay as much attention to what's going on out west. So, yeah, is there pushback? I imagine there is by some of the rewilder folks or something like that. Or?
Not really, Jim, from the rewilding folks. I'll pull that thread just for a minute. The rewilding. So think about that. Think about the human population that existed when, pick your animal. I'll pick grizzly bears. Roam freely across the western. It was a third. I don't even know what the right percentage is of what the human population is now. Think about the land development that has occurred in that time. I honestly say, I'm not trying to pick fights with anybody, but as a biologist, as a lifelong Westerner, except from my DC days, I can't get my head wrapped around that concept because it's not the same. It will never be the same. So you cannot put these species back the way they were in Lewis and Clark because it will never return to that type of landscape. And so I just had to pull on that thread a little bit because it fascinates me that some think that way because it's just theoretically impossible. Not theoretically, it's impossible to do. I want to be careful here because I'm still working on this issue, and I don't want. There is some people feel threatened by this work. I think anytime you develop a map, that is threatening to some folks. And so there's nothing that we do in this space, and I did have to fight this a lot. that's regulatory. There's no regulations involved. It's all voluntary. And when I first started doing this, a lot of people wanted to add more species, and I've seen this game played before. They just dilute stuff, and I'm like, I know you want every species, but we're not doing that. We're sticking to these 3 species that are listed: elk, mule deer, and pronghorn. That's it. That allowed us to keep that focus, and we said you can have up to 3 to 5 priority areas, migration corridors or winter range areas, that will spend money, will give you money to spend and do conservation in. Not 6, not 7, 5, 3 to 5. Keeping that focus. And I really did have to, I'm still having to do that. It's interesting. Really push back on that. But some other companies felt threatened that pronghorn are the one that are a little more concerning. I'll just cut to it. Pronghorn don't follow a nice path necessarily. They're more wanderers. And if you think about pronghorn, they're the only they're the only species that exist in there. I mean, they're very, very unique to North America, and they're declining. They're declining across all their range, and so they concern people because when they see a map of pronghorn, they just go everywhere. They are chasing resources. That's what pronghorn do. So, yeah, there has been some folks that have expressed some concern. And that's just part of the world we live in, and there's always going to be it. There's nothing that's perfect. I mean, so
yeah. And you talk about tolerance. People's level of tolerance and what they can accept. 2 of the species we talked about already, grizzly bears and elk. Historically, probably Lewis and Clark, they're prairie species. Now 2 things happened to that. The human population grew, and either the animals were intolerant of human encroachment, like elk are. They don't like disturbance, or the humans were intolerant of the species being there, like grizzly bears. So, I think the way people see them now is, largely, mountainous, impenetrable cover, almost wilderness area type species. That's because we've pushed them into a lot of that. That if they had their way and humans could tolerate them, they'd be down on the prairies. And
what's funny, John, that the grizzly bears are doing that now.
They're doing Montana. It. Yes.
Yeah, you'll find them out in the wheat fields in eastern Montana. I mean, they're following some of these river corridors down and popping out in places, and so and elk, same thing. I mean, you got elk in Nebraska. That's a big issue in Nebraska. Is the elk get in the cornfields, and I have seen what they do. They just live there. Why move? And they just flatten the corn out, and that's where they bed down. They get up, eat, lay back down. I mean, unbelievable. That's why they grow so big there.
I always used to tell people that, animals are, and I use the wrong term here, but I use it for effect, is animals are lazy, including humans. They can't afford to burn resources to find, food, cover, and shelter. If they can get it close by, they're going to go the easiest route possible to get that, because why burn more energy than you have to?
100%. Anyone that's followed cut a trail to your stand in the east. And come back the next day and see if there's deer tracks in that trail. If there's enough deer around, there'll be deer tracks in there. And to your point exactly. In the West is no different.
Oh, they walk a 2-strand barbed wire fence, a quarter of a mile to go through a gap where the fence is down, and they could have hopped over at any point, but it takes more energy. So we saw that when we put elk in Kentucky. Of course, most of ours came out of northern Utah, and huge migration patterns and all that. And we put them on the ground in Kentucky, and they went nowhere. And our source out there, Lou Cornicelli, we started comparing notes, and he goes, well, half the year ours eats sticks and rocks because there's nothing there, and they got wolves and bears and, you got big predators. He said, you got no predators, you got no winter kill, you got no snowfall, and you got vegetation 365 days a year. So why would an elk want to move? And that's exactly right. They don't migrate in some places because they don't have to. And why would you if you don't have to?
So what other projects you got working on? We're just rolling into 2026 here. What's on the docket for you?
Yeah, so now in retirement, I am still focusing a lot on, quote unquote. I retired when I could with the federal government with age and years, and we were talking about it earlier. You get to a point where it's time to go. You just get tired of paperwork, and that time was reached. And I said, well, everyone told me when they retire, make sure you have something to do. And I felt that, I've hunted and fished my entire life, and there's still a lot of things that are really pressing on what we do. And so I wanted to stay involved in policy in particular, and I wanted to keep this migration stuff going as well. And so I work with different clients now, and one I focus on the wildlife movement and connectivity, and we're making a lot of great progress still. I'm super happy to see Brian Nesvik as the director of Fish and Wildlife Service because he comes from Wyoming. He's a huge supporter of wildlife migrations and conservation. And I also am doing some policy work for a non-governmental organization in Washington, D.C., and that involves all kinds of stuff that affects sportsmen. And, from the outside, I have to admit, and I wish hunters and anglers really knew what some groups do for them day in and day out on Capitol Hill, in state legislators, and all my buddies that I grew up with aren't into this politics stuff. And when we get, yeah, exactly. But they don't realize what threats are out there that are nonstop that could impact what they love to do. And I know I go fishing with these guys and hunt with these guys, and I get a lot of questions, and it just always fascinates me that there's no way for them to know. Let's put it that way. We got to figure out a way to communicate better with the hunters and anglers that we have. I'm a big believer in, I told my dad this, I remember vividly. He used to bitch and moan about everything, and I asked him if he voted, and he said no. I said, well, I don't want to hear it. And now he votes, and he bitches and moans. He says, I vote. That's what he tells me, and so it's kind of funny. Yeah, it's honest story. We, as a community, a sportsman's community, though, I think we need to really start being more engaged and getting engaged in state legislative level. The federal government's fine. There's a lot of people working at that level. It's great to have them come back to D.C. I haven't met a member of Congress that doesn't like to see a constituent. They get tired of the same old lobbyists and tired of the same old people that they see all the time in D.C. They love seeing the hometown people. But the state legislatures, that's where some really crazy stuff pops up every year too. So there's a lot of work to do there. I feel we're failing significantly as well as local governments, planning departments. They make decisions every day. Let's go back to the winter range. It's not the federal government making those decisions or the state. It's the local planning department that are making. We don't spend a lot of time in that space. And some groups do. I'll just speak from a conservation sporting group side. We don't. And I think we really need to start focusing in those spaces. And so for me, I'm still involved. I was a migratory bird chief in our region out here in Colorado for a long time. And I'm still helping people with some migratory bird stuff. Got serious problems with migratory birds. It's just the facts. And they do this State of the Bird report, and you guys have probably heard about the 3 billion birds. Okay, that's one paper that's been published, but year in, year out, when they do this State of the Birds, you look at the guilds of birds that are declining. It's pretty serious, and I don't know when we start to really try to do something about it. I've always learned in politics, we don't do anything till the match is on your butt burning it. And I think it'll be too late if we wait that long. And so for me, I'm still very passionate about birds because I've just watched what's happened. You look at the bird feeder, you're seeing less birds, so there's something's going on. And the hard part about it, talking about migration, golly, I mean, they fly continents. They don't fly or just cross state boundaries. They cross continental boundaries, and so it's a lot more complicated. But if we had the will, there's a way to start doing some of the work we need to do. So I hope some focus really turns to migratory birds because we need it.
Gotcha. So where can folks go to, if they are interested, whether it's an NGO or just an individual sports person? Because, like you said, there are groups that are out there and they're probably not friendly to, the same things that we're looking at doing. So we need a voice. And how can folks get involved and where do they pay attention?
Yeah, I think, in the migration space, a great resource is WAFWA, the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, their website. It's Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies.org. And if you get on their website, there's a whole, the initiative that I spoke of earlier is on there. And then there's a whole page on a committee that they have focused on wildlife movement and migrations. And it has a lot of information on this topic. That's a good resource from there. I think the Congressional Sportsman Foundation, based in Washington, D.C., is a very good resource for policy. Safari Club's a good resource in D.C. for policy. And then you got your local groups. I mean, my gosh, mule deer, Rocky Mountain elk, Ducks Unlimited, Delta, PF, Pheasants Forever. All those folks have people that are working in Washington D.C. Some of those folks work also on the state legislative level, but they're certainly not working on the local level. So I would just encourage your listeners to keep doing what you're doing, supporting conservation. Obviously, you're listening to the podcast, but just know that there's a lot of room for you to be more engaged if you can find the time, and that's at all those levels that I spoke: federal, state, and local.
Well, Casey, we appreciate you coming on, talking with us for a bit. Always been a good friend. You're a great friend to conservation. I think you're a little touched moving from Alaska to DC still. That still disturbs me on some level, but certainly you've been doing the Lord's work. I'll say that, because it takes a special person to be able to bridge that interface between on the ground, conservation work and the policy and even the bigger P, politics of conservation. That's a huge chasm, and we hope you keep engaged and keep doing that in your next page in life. But thanks for coming on. To our listeners, appreciate you listening to this. If you get a chance, go visit some of these groups or websites that we put on the screen there. They are critical to conservation. They're critical to what we all love and believe in. If you like clean air, clean water, healthy environments, healthy forests, all of that comes about by managing wildlife and fishery species properly. So take a look at some of the work that's been done, and more importantly, the work that needs to be done going forward, and get involved. Other than that, we'll see you in the woods or on the water, and thanks for listening. If you like this, give us a subscribe to us and give us a thumbs up, and you'll get notices when our next episodes drop. But thanks for listening, and have a good day. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Connecting with Conservation podcast. Please do us a favor and tell your buddies, friends, family, and others about what you've learned here today. If you like what you heard, come on back anytime and listen to another episode of the Connecting with Conservation podcast.